Pennsylvania, and he was asked to serve in the Civil War. So he joined the Pennsylvania militia. It was a volunteer group, and he served very typical, like most volunteer groups. He served about 8 months, and then he went back home. He, like so many other volunteers, was asked to serve a second time. He did volunteer to serve a second time. They didn't know it at the time, but it was starting to get toward the end of the Civil War. I'm not a Civil War buff. I'm not going to sit here and talk about the Civil War all evening, but I do want to tell you that Andrew Harbison was in one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. It was called the Battle of Cold Harbor, just outside of Richmond, Virginia. In that battle, Andrew Harbison was injured. His left heel was shot off. They did some surgery on him there, kind of a field operation, if you will. And then they sent him to Jefferson Barracks, which was the Union Hospital just outside of St. Louis, Missouri. There, they did some additional surgery on his left foot. And like all the other soldiers, they put him outside in a tent hospital. While he was out there, he contracted an ear infection and lost hearing in 1 year. So for the next 39 years of his life, he walked on the toes on his left foot and was deaf in one ear. Very much everyday life, very ordinary, but he was alive. After recovering from his surgery in Jefferson Barracks, he went back to Pennsylvania, and he was in Missouri for over a year and a half recuperating. He went back to his wife and 2 children, and he said, Missouri was beautiful. Why don't we move out there and start life over again? So that's what he decided to do. He said, I'm going to move out west, and I'll send you money and move you out west with me. This is, of course, saying to his wife. So he jumped on a train with his 11-year-old son, Harry, and headed for Missouri. Well, because he had to get off of the train and earn a little bit of money so he could send it back to his wife, and he and Harry could eat a little bit, it took him almost a full 2 years to get back to western Missouri. During that 2-year period, he told his son Harry that his mother had passed away and his little sister was now being raised by her grandparents, which was true, she was. They made it to western Missouri finally. Andrew met another lady. Her name was Mary Quinlan, and they got married, and they started having children of their own. I kind of like to think of it as maybe the second Harbison family. But Andrew was working odd jobs. He'd go from ranch to ranch or farms and help raise crops or take care of animals, whatever he could do. And they moved up and down the eastern Kansas and Nebraska and western Missouri border. And the children were born in different areas because of that. But they had a daughter, Annie, they had a daughter, Kittie, and a son, Rob or Robert. And you'll get to know these people as we go along. You'll see them in photos too here in a little while. So while they were doing this over a period of 8 or 9 years, Harry, who was still living with them, was growing up and becoming just about 20 years old. And he said, I'm going to move on and start a life of my own. I'm going to go to the mountains of Colorado and be a gold miner and strike it rich. Well, he did end up in Leadville, Colorado, but he was a gold miner, not a mine owner. And the miners, they weren't paid very much money. But he got married there. He met a lady in Leadville and they got married and they had a son. He said, I've got to provide a better income for my wife and my child. So he went to work for the United States government in the second facility of its kind in the entire United States. It was a fish hatchery. Harry Harbison was learning how to raise baby rainbow trout to stock into the streams and the high mountain lakes, because by now this was the early 1880s and people were coming to Colorado and they were bringing their fishing pole with them. So he did this for several years, but he kept hearing from some of the local restaurants that they would like him to sell them some trout for the menu. Well, after a while, you're going to hear that Harry Harbison was a little bit of a scoundrel, but even Harry knew he could not sell fish out of a federal facility. He knew how illegal that was. So he got to wondering with his wife and said, what if I open my own commercial fish hatchery? Then I can raise all the trout I want and I can sell them and make a little bit of money. So that's what they decided to do. Harry wandered around the mountains of Colorado a little bit, and he stumbled on the Grand Lake area. About a mile outside of the village of Grand Lake and the lake itself, he found a small lake by the name of Carlton Lake. He said, this small lake would be perfect for my fish hatchery. So he went back to Leadville, got his wife and son, and moved all their possessions and built himself a small house. And he went down to Grand Lake with a net and netted a bunch of trout out of Grand Lake, took them all up to Carlton Lake and dumped them in. And they all died. Carlton Lake is a spring-fed lake. The water comes out of the ground. Well, fish need aeration. They need air movement and running water. And Harry probably said to himself, I should have known that. So he went out and he found a stream that was running down into Grand Lake called Hanahutu Stream, put a shovel in the side of it and started digging a ditch to Carlton Lake. By now, this was 1889, and it took him 2 full summers to dig this ditch, 2 miles, because we still call these the Rocky Mountains. Well, he got the fresh running water into Carlton Lake and went down to Grand Lake and got some more trout, put them all in, and they still lived. And there's still trout in that lake today that are descendants of the fish that Harry put in there. Well, in that 2-year period while he was digging the ditch, he did some checking and asked some old timers around the Grand Lake area, and nobody seemed to know who Carlton was. They don't know who the lake was named after. So Harry and his wife changed the name of the lake to what we know it as today, and that would be Columbine Lake, just not quite a mile outside of Grand Lake. Here's Harry at his house. Now, this picture was taken a number of years later. You can see he's added on to it several times. A camera-shy wife down there in the garden. But that's Harry's house. As a matter of fact, that house is still in use today on the side of Columbine Lake. And here is his fish hatchery at Columbine Lake. You can see all he needed was a small building. Columbine Lake today looks a lot different than it did in 1889 and 1890 when Harry was there digging the ditch, and for several years after that. Columbine Lake is now a subdivision of its own. It has 134 homes on the shore of Columbine Lake, and their homeowners association, it's private and pretty secluded. Any of you that might have driven in would understand what I'm talking about, but it looks a lot different than it did then. Well, the other Harbison family, Andrew and Mary and the 3 children, they would come to visit Harry a couple of times out here in Colorado. On one of their trips out, Harry met them down in Denver, and this picture was taken of Harry and his father. These were studio pictures. These pictures were very expensive, and you had to stand perfectly still for 32 seconds while your image was burned onto a glass negative. And if you flinched or moved or anything like that, you messed the picture up, you had to pay for a second picture. And these pictures were $8 to $10 each. Well, Andrew Harbison had bounced job to job, and he wasn't making very much money, but he did have a little bit of income because of his injury from the Civil War. He was receiving a pension check, and in 1890, it was all the way up to $7 a month. And photos were $8 to $10. It was a month's salary to have your picture taken. So you didn't mess up very often. It was way too expensive for that. Well, the family would come and go to Colorado several times. And again, because money was always tight back in eastern Nebraska, they said, Colorado is beautiful. Why don't we move out there and we'll start life over again? So they loaded all their possessions in a wagon and they came all the way to Denver. Andrew got a job downtown Denver and they were getting settled in. And this was 1891. And they wanted some property of their own for a change. So Andrew and Mary decided to file a homestead north of Denver, about 60 miles near the town of Greeley. You know, when we talk about homesteading, many of us have probably heard that term, and some of you may know what it's all about, but we actually have had four homestead laws in our country. The most popular one, and the one most people have heard about, especially these days, was the 1862 version that President Lincoln signed. That said that the federal government would give you up to 160 acres of land for free. All you had to do was build a house on it the first year and then improve the agriculture every year for the remaining 4 years. So after 5 years, you would apply for your land patent, what we would know today as a title or a deed, and then you would own the land. The government would give you this land. So Andrew and Mary, they filed their homestead and got going, and they built a small cabin. Andrew still had his job downtown Denver, so he'd catch the trolley to Greeley up on the weekends, and the rest of the family would be working on the fences and building some corrals and purchasing a little bit of livestock and a plow and that kind of stuff to raise a little bit of food with. So they were getting settled in, and 1891, that was a pretty good year for them. 92, they were really making a good go of it. And then 1893 hit. We had a terrible depression in our country. For those of you that have heard about the 1893 silver bust, our government decided to base our monetary system on gold and take it off of the silver standard. Well, the price of silver just died overnight. It was not valuable anymore because the government wasn't buying any of it. So our entire nation, that was part of it, but the depression that was caused by that was horrendous. It hit Colorado especially hard because that's where the silver was coming from. Yeah, they were still mining a little bit of it in Nevada and other places, but the majority of the silver for the government was coming from the mines in Colorado. Well, as soon as it hit, all of Colorado shut down, and Andrew Harbison lost his job downtown Denver, just like everybody else. But they had the ranch up by Greeley, so he just went up there. I can imagine him talking to his family saying, I lived through the Depression of 1859. It wasn't very bad. We know how these go. 6 or 8 months, we'll all be back to work and everything will be fine and we'll all be recovered. Well, now, of course, we all know that that's not how that works most of the time. And it was not in 1893 either. By the end of 1893, Andrew, of course, was still not working, but they had his pension check to live on. But in 1893, $7 a month didn't go very far. And by 1894, they were starting to run out of food. So they started selling things. They started selling their plows and their wagon and some of their livestock just to put some food on the table. By late 1894, they were almost out of stuff to sell. And they said, we've got to do something. We visited Harry up there at Grand Lake, and that Grand Lake area is beautiful. Why don't we move up there and start life over again? So they said, we'll just go up there and file for a homestead and start over. But they couldn't. Andrew and Mary already had a homestead, and it hadn't been 5 years since they'd moved in, so they didn't have their land patent, so they could not file another homestead. But the girls could. Annie, who was now 27, and Kittie, who had just turned 24, they were old enough to file their homesteads. Their younger brother, Rob, was only 19, and you had to be 21 to file a homestead, or there'd have probably been 3 right next to each other, and my story'd be all messed up. But the two girls decided to file homesteads side by side because they were always very, very close with each other. So in the spring of 1895, they came up to the Grand Lake area to look around, and Harry took them out and he said, I know a perfect spot for your homesteads. I'll show you some land that just happens to have a fresh water ditch running right through the middle of it. So they homesteaded about 3/4 of a mile from Columbine Lake. They filed for their homesteads in 1895. In 1896, they got permission to come up and start on their homesteads. And that's how the Harbison became some of the pioneers of Grand Lake. They weren't the first settlers up here. They were not the first homestead. They were the third homestead in the area. But they were truly considered pioneers of Grand Lake. Several times this evening, I'm going to read to you. Andrew Harbison kept a diary, and this is his journal that you're seeing. He kept this journal for about 6 years when they got here. And a couple of times this evening, I'd like to read to you. And this first time is about how they got here. He wrote this on the 20th of January, 1897. He said, I arrived at Grand Lake July 15th, 1896. Annie and Kittie arrived here September 11th. Mary and Robert arrived November 1st. Since coming here, we've done considerable work on the girls' homesteads, built a cabin, and moved into it on January 8th, 1897. The first snow fell about the 25th of October. We have snow frequently since. The snow at present is about 20 inches deep. We've all had good health since coming here. The winter so far has been moderate. Doesn't that sound like pretty ordinary life? The Harbison Ranch is about a mile north of the village of Grand Lake that we know today. And in the middle of January, 20 inches of snow at their ranch is a very, very average winter. Not like this year. We didn't have anywhere near 20 inches this year, but in January. But that's a very average winter where the Harbison Ranch is. And he said the winter so far has been moderate. Little did he know. Both of the girls, Annie and Kittie, they many years later wrote memories of their life also. Annie, she loved to write. And we know that she picked up her father's journal and would flip through the pages to kind of, get a reminder of what was going on when. We know she did that because sometimes she copied it word for word. But she wrote quite a bit. Kittie, all of her life memories are on the back of one envelope. And most of it has to do with livestock. Bought 2 cows from the Mitchells, sold a horse to the Johnstons, that kind of stuff over different years. But I'd like to read a couple of times also from Annie's memories. And this is what she said about coming up. It starts off the very same as her father's. July 15th, 1896, father came to Grand Lake. September 11th, 1896, Kittie and I came to Grand Lake. November 1st, 1896, mother and Bobby came to Grand Lake. And that's where the comparison is the same, but she did continue. She said, Harry and I went to Denver after them. They had 2 horses. We were storm stayed from Tuesday until Friday at the Big Chief Mine. Friday, mother and I started to walk, leading Jersey and Lady. That was the cow and the calf that they were going to start a dairy ranch with. The snow was 18 inches all the way over the range. We all got to the old stage stop this side of the range near the top. That night, wet and cold. The next night, we stayed at the block home, the other side of Coulter. The next night, we got to Columbine Lake and glad to get home. For those of you that are familiar with Interstate 70 between Denver and Glenwood and Newcastle, when you're going west out of Denver, you'll come to exit 232 to Empire, the town of Empire, and up and over Highway 40 over Berthoud Pass. That drops down into several towns, Winter Park, Fraser, Tabernash, Granby, and then north into Grand Lake and right to the edge of Rocky Mountain National Park. This trip that I've just described was from the town of Empire over Berthoud Pass. I hope some of you have had an opportunity to drive over Highway 40 Berthoud Pass. But the first day, after they sat in a mine, the Big Chief Mine, this was about a mile west of the town of Empire, and they sat there and watched it snow for 3 days, and then started walking, dragging a cow and calf behind him. Now, of course, the two horses would have broken trail for them a little bit, but they were still walking through the snow. And up on top of the mountain, they were through 18 inches of snow. They stayed at the old stage stop that night. The next night, they walked down the west side of Berthoud Pass to what is called the block home. There were a number of block homes around Colorado. These are nothing more than usually a square house, usually 2 stories high. And the people that were from the area, they just stayed there overnight, kind of a free hotel, if you will. But this was located near Coulter. Coulter was a stagecoach stop about 4 miles south of today's town of Granby, Colorado. And then that third day, they just made that last quick 24 miles up to Columbine Lake, and they were glad to get home. Can't you walk 24 miles in a day? Well, think about it. They probably teamed up on the 2 horses a little bit of it, but even still, these people walked everywhere. And they'd get up and they were walking before the sun ever came up. And if they needed to, they were still walking after dark that evening to get where they were going, and they were headed home. So they even if they were there late at night, which I don't know for sure, but they got there that day back to Columbine Lake. And Annie said they were glad to get home. This is why. They built their cabin and opened it January 8th, 1897. Annie said, "We moved in our first little cabin. It was home, sweet home, and we were so happy." Well, their little cabin is not this one. Their little cabin is under the eave of the shorter building off to the right there. And that little building there was their first homestead cabin. From the photos, it looks like it might have been maybe 10 feet by at the most 16 feet. All 5 adults lived in there. And the first winter, they hadn't built a barn, so the cow and the calf slept inside with them at night also, because if they left them out overnight, they'd have frozen to death. But Annie said they were so happy because they got to move out of the tent. They were living in a tent in 20 inches of snow, building their first homestead cabin. Now, the picture that you see was taken many, many years later. It was taken in 1962. Off to the left, you see what they called the big cabin, kind of what we would know today as, maybe a big living room. And off to the right, they added a few years after that, a kitchen and just an extra room off of Annie's homestead cabin. And this are those same buildings with 20 inches of snow. Are you ready to move to Homestead just outside of Grand Lake? Well, in 1897, the very next year, to comply with the Homestead Laws, they built Kittie's cabin on her side of the property line. They homesteaded side by side, shared a property line, and you can see these cabins just weren't very big. Eventually, they would use these cabins as kind of bedrooms and then use the big cabin as their living room. They also called Kittie's cabin, because it always was kept apart, they always called that the little cabin. Well, that first spring that they were here, they went down to the beach near Grand Lake, and this photo was taken of the family, a beautiful family photo. Father probably took this photo, but you see Mother on the left. In the middle are the 2 girls. That's Kittie seated on the rock, and her older sister Annie behind her, and their younger brother Rob off to the right. You can see it a little bit in this picture if you look close, but Rob Harbison was partially blind all of his life. I don't know why. I just know that he was. I've seen his elementary school picture, and you can really see it in it. He wasn't blind. He could read a newspaper with a strong enough magnifying glass, and he could walk through the trees without hitting trees. He worked a lot on shadows. The 2 girls, well, they weren't exactly night and day, but Well, to tell you, she was kind of like her mother, a little laid back and a little conservative. Annie, well, look at her. She was considered the life of the party. And look at her in the photo, looking off into the trees, big smile on her face. Many people called her the life of the party. And she'd dance all night and get up and milk cows in the morning. So there was a difference in the girls. Let me, let me try it this way. Let's take a recipe and say it calls for 2 eggs. Kitty, she might have said, well, wouldn't it be just as good with one? Annie, she probably would have said, oh, how much better would it be with 3? And that kind of shows you the difference in the girls. I'm going to refer back to this picture a little bit later. And, so pay attention to their fine dresses and their beautiful hats and the fact that Annie, because the girls were always so close, even though they were 4 years apart in age, Annie has her hands on Kitty's shoulders. I'm going to read from Andrew's journal again. Now, this time, this was written almost 2 years later to the day. This was written in January 27th, 1899. He wrote, all hands breaking roads and shoveling snow off the buildings. Mr. Schnorr and Mr. Hedrick was here this evening. They tried to get to Grand Lake, but stuck in the snow and had to turn back. Snowed most of the day. The snow is about 49 inches deep. This is the deepest snow I have seen in 30 years. Remember that moderate winter 2 years before with 20 inches of snow on the ground? Well, this wasn't a moderate winter. This was the terrible, terrible blizzard of 1898, 1899. In the Grand Lake area and many parts of the mountains, this was the second worst blizzard in the mountains. Of course, with our snowstorm that especially hit the Front Range, 10 days ago or so, we heard a lot about the worst blizzard being in 1913. And that was the worst blizzard of all of Colorado was 1913. And this was a pretty close second to it. But imagine that. Now they've got 4 feet of snow on the ground instead of 20 inches. And about that same time, this is a photo of Annie was taken. Beautiful young lady that she was. I mentioned a man's name that Andrew wrote about, Mr. Schnorr. That was Henry Schnorr. He owned the Green Mountain Ranch. It was just the next ranch up the valley from the Harbisons. Henry Schnorr was a contractor downtown Grand Lake. Well, he came past the Harbisons on the stagecoach road to go to work every day. And the road ran right in front of their house. Well, you know what I'm going to say. He stopped in every couple days and had coffee with his neighbors, and things went along great. Sure, I'm going to say it. He fell in love with Kittie Harbison, and he asked her to marry him. And Kittie said yes, because she had fallen in love with Henry Schnorr. Especially for the gentleman in the audience tonight, I know Henry Schnorr was in love with Kittie, because as soon as she said yes, and him being a contractor, he went back to his home at Green Mountain Ranch, and he built that bay window on the west side of the kitchen of his home because Kittie Harbison loved her geraniums. Well, they were sitting around Harbison Ranch, especially Annie and Kittie, and talking about the upcoming wedding that they were going to have at, the big party they were going to have at the Harbison Ranch and a chivalry after it. And apparently, Kittie turned to Annie and out of the blue said something like, I can't marry Henry Schnorr. Well, you can imagine that Annie would have said, well, heavens, why not? And Kittie said, I've been thinking about it. Mother and father are getting older. And Rob helps around the ranch, but he moves kind of slow because of his blindness. Annie, you're not going to be able to run this ranch by yourself. And you know what? If I marry Henry Schnorr, half of the Harbison Ranch disappears. It had not been 5 years. They were still borrowing the Harbison Ranch from the government. They didn't own the Harbison Ranch yet because they hadn't fulfilled their homestead. So half the ranch would have gone away. So she got on her horse and rode about a mile up to Henry's ranch and told him no, and she jilted Henry Schnorr. Well, apparently Henry was a pretty good guy. He actually found another woman down in Grand Lake the next summer. They got married and had two little girls of their own, but he still stopped for coffee all the time and said hi. He was a good neighbor of the Harbison, so he was there all the time. Also, about 1899, Andrew and Rob were sitting around, and Rob had started delivering milk downtown Grand Lake from the dairy ranch to the people down there. And they were saying, Rob, we have to see you every day. We can't keep the milk cold enough. We've got an ice box, but it just doesn't keep it cold. So Andrew and Rob got their heads together in the middle of the winter and said, you know what? Why don't we go down to Grand Lake with an ice saw and we'll cut blocks of ice out and bring it back up. And they had built an ice house to store it in. And this is Rob next to his ice sleigh with his two horses, Dolly and Polly. And Rob would go down and cut about 2-foot square blocks of ice out of the lake and store them over the winter. They'd cover them up with sawdust, something they had a lot of from cutting down all the trees and everything. But they'd cover it up with sawdust, and that way Rob could deliver ice with milk the next summer. I think this was probably a financial decision because they were selling a quart of milk for 5 cents, but they could sell ice for 10 cents. So it was probably pretty much based on the financial situation, but that's what they did to take care of the townspeople of Grand Lake about that same period. Here's a picture. This picture was taken many years later, but that's Rob Harbison standing in the back of that wagon. Behind him is John Mitchell with an ice saw. An ice saw is similar to a two-man tree saw, but the teeth are made differently. They're a different angle than a tree saw. And that's a block of ice. Maybe you can pick it out next to John Mitchell's feet there. But you can tell this picture was taken a lot of years later. Shoot, there's a car out there on the lake with them. And the building in the background, that's the Grand Lake Yacht Club. And that was built in 1912. So this is a lot of years later. But just to give you an example of how they move some of this ice around. 1901 was a very important year for the Harbisons. The girls had been working part-time in some of the summers downtown Grand Lake to raise some money because Andrew's pension check sure didn't go very far. And in 1901, they leased the Kaufman House Hotel. Mrs. Kaufman and her children had left, and Mr. Kaufman, who still owned the hotel, just leased it to Annie and Kitty. So they were able to make quite a bit of money in 1901. And after that, they didn't have to work downtown as maids and waitresses. 1901 was also a very important year because it now had been 5 years. So they applied for their land patents. And in 1902, both Annie and Kitty got their land patents and finally owned the entire Harbison Ranch, all 320 acres of it. Well, let's do a little bit of math. I know there's mathematicians out there in the audience, but they applied for their homestead rights in 1895. They got permission to come up and they started their homestead in 1896. And in 1901, they filed for their land patent. In 1902, they got their land patent. Shoot, that was only 7 years for a 5-year government program. That's pretty good, even by today's standards. And then you think about all the mail that had to happen in between. What do you think? You think that worked out pretty good for them? But finally, they owned the ranch. They were getting settled into the routine of Annie and Kitty did an awful lot of the milking of the cows. Rob would then hook up a wagon to a team, probably Dolly and Polly, and deliver milk all over downtown Grand Lake. And then he would load some of the cans in a rowboat that they owned, and he would row 3/4 of a mile across Grand Lake and deliver milk across the lake. In 1906, Andrew Harbison passed away. Think of the life that man led. It was pretty ordinary, but some of the things that he did. He served in the Civil War. He went into the Civil War when he was 30 years old. He served a second time. His left heel was shot off. He moved to Missouri to start life over again, had a second family, moved to Denver to start life over again, moved to Grand Lake when he was 69 years old, or excuse me, 66 years old, to start life over again. Pretty ordinary or extraordinary life. Well, by 1906, Harry had just about had it raising fish up over at Columbine Lake. And his first wife left him. She went over to Western Colorado, to Montrose, south of where you guys are. And he said, well, I'll get married again. He married his second wife. That didn't work out too well. About 7 or 8 months later, he rode his horse over to our county seat in Hot Sulphur Springs. Well, by horseback, that's almost a 6-hour horseback ride each way. So he got over there to the county seat. He was filling out the paperwork and, I'd like to divorce my second wife. And they said, okay, fill out this paperwork. You know how that goes. And he said, while I'm here, let me go ahead and do the paperwork to go ahead and divorce my first wife too. Okay, so he was married to 2 women at the same time for a few months. But again, it was a long horseback ride. He divorced his second wife so he could marry his third wife, because his third wife, Betty, owned this 2-story building downtown Grand Lake, and he wanted to open the Harbison store. So he married Betty and had the store. There's a sign up on top that says Post Office, Harry Harbison, fine, upstanding gentleman in our community. After all, he was the postmaster. Okay, we'll let it slide that he was married to 2 women at the same time, maybe. So, but he operated the Harbison store. As a matter of fact, that building that you see in the photo still stands today. It's on our historic walking tour of Grand Lake called the Harbison store. Well, after Andrew passed away, I should have warned you about this photo. That really is a woman. This is Mary Harbison. This is Mom. This is Andrew's wife. But again, as the picture that I showed you at the beginning of Andrew, this was a studio picture, very expensive. And you can imagine having to sit perfectly still for over a half a minute. And you sat there telling yourself, I'm not going to mess up. I'm not going to mess up. I'm not going to mess up. So you sat really, really still. I've seen other photos of Mary Harbison, big smile on her face. Everybody called her Mother Harbison. They really loved her. When you go into museums, for instance, if you see some of these photos with some of the stern looking people, pay attention to the frame and the photo. It's usually an oval, and these oval pictures, especially if they have an oval frame, are almost always studio pictures. And they were expensive, and people said they weren't going to mess up. Well, Mary Harbison, when Andrew passed away, she wrote a letter to the Civil War Commission, said, I'm Andrew's widow, and I would like to continue to receive his pension check. And by 1906, it was now all the way up to $14 a month. The Civil War Commission wrote her a nice letter back, and I'm going to paraphrase these letters that I'm going to talk about, but basically they wrote back and said, please accept our condolences for your loss, and we'd like to send the $14 a month out, but what about the first Mrs. Harbison? Well, Mary, of course, wrote him a letter and said, no, the first Mrs. Harbison, I know all about her. She's been dead for over 30 years. Andrew and I have been married for almost 32 years. I'm his lawful widow. Please send me my $14 check. Well, the Civil War Commission wrote her a letter back and said, well, we've received a letter from a Mrs. Andrew Harbison in Altoona, Pennsylvania, and she would like her $14 a month pension check. Well, you can imagine how upsetting that was to Mary Harbison. Here in Grand Lake, she wrote him another letter, and she said, you must have the wrong Mrs. Andrew Harbison. Harbison is a very common name in Pennsylvania, and it was then, and it is now. Harbison still is a very, very popular name all over Pennsylvania. Uh, so she wrote back and said, I've confirmed with her son Harry that his mother has been dead for over 30 years. You've got the wrong lady. Please send me my check. The Civil War Commission wrote her a nice letter and said, well, here's a copy of a letter that we've received. And basically it said, what do you mean Harry says I'm dead? He came and visited me 2 summers ago and borrowed some money from my second husband. The first Mrs. Harbison was very much alive. Andrew Harbison, like so many Civil War veterans, had simply walked out on his first wife. Yes, he probably did send her money for a while, but after a while he gave up doing that and he found another lady and they got married and started another family. But wait, didn't I tell you that he told his son Harry that his mother had passed away and that his little sister was being raised by her grandparents? And I told you that that was the truth, and it was the truth. His little sister, for some reason, was raised by her grandparents. I don't know why. Her mother was very much alive and she should have been raising her, but for some reason she didn't. I kind of just, well, maybe stretched it a little bit for you, but it was true. Harry's sister was raised by his grandparents. Finally, after 2 years of these letters going back and forth and back and forth, the first Mrs. Harbison in Altoona, Pennsylvania said, she obviously needs that $14 a month more than I do. Just give it to her. And so the Civil War Commission started giving Mary that $14 a month. While all of that nonsense was going on, the Harbisons had heard a gentleman up the valley, a little closer to Estes Park, had built a hotel because he had heard that people were riding horseback between Estes Park and Grand Lake over the old Indian trails. They were called tourists. His name was Squeaky Bob Wheeler, and he built Hotel de Hardscrabble for them to stop at. Well, he was on the same road that the Harbisons were, and the Harbisons were 10 miles closer to Grand Lake. So they said, if he can do it, why don't we? So they built these cabins back in the trees on the Harbison Ranch. Over a period of several years, they would end up with 7 of these cabins. Again, I believe this was had a lot to do with a financial decision. They could rent these for $1 a night. And this was 1907 to 1910 era. So that was a lot of money and a lot of income for them. So again, this was another financial decision on their part. I have talked a couple of times about Henry Schnorr. Remember, Kitty jilted him. Well, as I mentioned earlier, he got married and had a wife, and they had 2 young daughters. And they were living out at Green Mountain Ranch. And his wife, like so many other women in the mountains of Colorado, came to her husband and said, I am not staying in this God-forsaken land any longer. And she left. Most of those women got divorces and they left and went somewhere warmer. But she did something that most women didn't do. And I'm going to let that sink in for just a second. Let you women especially think about it. What do you think she did? Sure, some of you probably said it to yourself. She left the kids. Well, Henry Schnorr was a contractor. At the turn of our last century, we're talking about roughly 1904, 1905, men didn't know how to raise children. That's not what their job was. Harry didn't know what to do with 2 young daughters. The older one was about 4.5, 5 years old. The younger one was only about 14, 15 months old, and she had not learned how to walk yet. She was carried around on a pillow. We don't know what was the matter with her. I know she was walking just a few months later, but she couldn't walk yet. So Harry loaded his daughters in his wagon and took them to an orphanage in Denver. Well, the people at the orphanage said, we've got a building that's full of sick children that don't have any parents. You're their father. Take them home and just try and do the best you can. Well, that's what he did. He loaded his daughters up in his wagon and came back to Grand Lake. Sure, I'm going to say it. You know I am. He stopped at the Harbison Ranch. And of course, told him the story about it. And what did the girls say? Of course, they said, leave them here. We'll take care of them. We're women. We must know how to take care of girls. Mother is here. We'll be just fine. So this picture was taken that day, and that's what Henry Schnorr decided to do. That's Henry on the left holding his older daughter, Beatrice. That's Annie in the middle holding the baby. Her name was Mary, but remember that was mother's name. So they nicknamed her Mame or Mamie, and that's mother on the right. And one of their dogs, Scout, in the middle there. You know, Henry Schnorr was not abandoning his daughters by leaving him at the Harbison Ranch. I mean, he still came up and down the same road and stopped in every day or two for coffee and saw his girls. This was just Grand Lake's first daycare center. And it worked out pretty good. A few years later, Henry met another lady in Grand Lake, and they got married. And he was bringing her out to the Green Mountain Ranch. And they stopped by the Harbison Ranch and said, okay, girls, here's your new mom. Come on, let's go home. Well, Beatrice, she was almost 8 by now. And she said, sure, fine, let's go. Well, the younger girl, Mame, who was probably about maybe 2.5, 3 years old at the time, she wrapped her arms around Kittie and Annie's legs and said, no, these are my mommy. Well, think about it. You know, if she got there when she was 14, 15 months old, it's basically the only parents she'd really known for that short time. And you can imagine the new wife might have said, well, that's one less mouth I have to feed. But even if she didn't, it was not abandoning her. She just was left at the Harbison Ranch. It was just a matter of convenience. And again, they went back and forth. Both families went back and forth to each other's ranch. They shared supper together. For years, Beatrice would ride her horse down to the Harbison Ranch because Mame grew up on the Harbison Ranch, but she had her own pet porcupine. So her older sister, Beatrice, would come down to play with the porcupine. I'm going to refer back to the photo I showed you of the family down on the beach. Remember the bows and their hats and the beautiful dresses? This next picture was taken roughly 20 to 22, 23 years later. Ranch life was not particularly kind to Kittie and Annie Harbison. But this is Mame with them as a young teenager, still living at the Harbison Ranch, and she would continue to live at the Harbison Ranch. Okay. And of course, young girls, they were allowed to wear jeans by then. Of course, not older women, but by now, depending upon, I don't know exactly when this picture was taken, but we are guessing that Annie would have been between 47 and 50 years old, and Kittie was 4 years younger than that. So, but this was a tough life. They did a lot of hard work around the ranch. As I mentioned, they milked the cows. They took care of the cows. They all cleaned the barns. They all did all kinds of the hard work. They cut wood. They split firewood. It was hard work for everybody. But not all the time. Sometimes they would just sit back and enjoy it. How about a beautiful Christmas tree? Now this picture was taken in the big cabin. They put a Christmas tree up on top of Andrew's desk. You know, they'd have a very typical Christmas tree. They'd cut it down on the lot there. They would generally have Christmas festivities Christmas Eve, because they had the Christmas tree and they'd make a popcorn string for them. They probably made all their hand ornaments and they put live candles on it. So Christmas Eve after dark, they could light the candles. They probably had made a small gift for each other and exchanged that. And then 15, 20 minutes later, they blew the candles out and Christmas was over. Well, it's not too hard to figure. They've got a dead tree in the middle of a log cabin with live candles burning on it. Yeah, they're going to blow them out pretty quick. And Christmas was over. But one of the things I want to pay attention to are the books down under the Christmas tree. Andrew Harbison was a very well-read man. He had a fine collection of books. I wish I had some of those books, but the whole family was literate. You know, again, at the turn of our last century, 1900, it wasn't unusual for women to be illiterate in the family, and it wasn't unheard of them to be very literate. And the whole family was very literate. They could all read and write very, very well. As I mentioned, even with Rob's blindness, with a strong magnifying glass, he could read a newspaper and he could read books. A few years start tumbling by at the Harbison Ranch. And in 1912 and 1914, there were people in the Estes Park area that were trying to establish a new national park. Well, the Colorado Mountain Club, a hiking club based in the Denver area and still in existence today, they were very instrumental in helping to establish this new national park. And two of their members went by train to the Wind River Indian Reservation in Wyoming and spoke to some of the Arapaho and asked if any of their elders remembered the area that they used to call Spirit or Holy Lake. And that was Grand Lake to the, or it was Spirit Lake to the Arapaho. Two of the elders spoke up and said, we were little boys there. They invited those two elders and their interpreter to come back and do a horseback trip through what would become Rocky Mountain National Park. And they were interested in what the Arapaho called different areas and different sites. The people that are in the background in that picture, that tall drink of water is Oliver Toll. He took just copious notes as these gentlemen spoke to their interpreter and it got interpreted. And now we have 37 sites inside Rocky Mountain National Park that have Arapaho names from this pack trip. The valley itself on the west side of Rocky, where the Harbison Ranch is the Kawanichi Valley. The lady that you see next to Sherman Sage's horse, one of the elders, that is Mary Lyons Cairns. She was married to James Cairns. He owned the local mercantile store downtown Grand Lake. That's their daughter, Patience Cairns. Mary Lyons Cairns wrote the first two history books about Grand Lake, and her daughter grew up and opened and operated the Kaufman House Museum in Grand Lake. I hope some of you have an opportunity to come to Grand Lake and visit the Kaufman House Museum. It's a wonderful small town museum. It's only open in the summer, but well, this pack trip happened in 1914. In 1915, on January 26, 1915, President Woodrow Wilson signed the bill establishing Rocky Mountain National Park. The people in Estes Park were ecstatic. They said, we've got to celebrate. We've got to throw a big party. We've got to invite everybody. Who's going to snowshoe to Estes Park in the middle of January? Nobody. How about we have a big party next summer? So on September 4th, 1915, they dedicated Rocky Mountain National Park. And you can tell by this photo, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people showed up. Well, you guys live in the mountains. What happens when you throw a party in the summertime? Sure, it rained off and on all day long during the festivity. Hence that guy standing there with an umbrella and everybody in their coats. But not everybody liked the new Rocky Mountain National Park, especially the Harbisons. The national park people came to the Harbison Ranch and they said, aren't you excited? We now have Rocky Mountain National Park surrounding your dairy ranch on all four sides. Plop. By the way, did we tell you we don't allow cows inside a national park? Sell us your dairy ranch and leave. And the girls said, absolutely not. We don't trust you. We consider you government revenuers. And they refused to sell the ranch to the national park. Year after year after year, they kept saying, this is our baby. We brought this ranch up from nothing. We were here 19 years before you ever got here. Just leave us alone. And they did raise their cows, and they did continue to deliver milk to Grand Lake for many years. And they delivered ice with it for many, many years. So the park left them alone for many years. They'd ask them every now and then if they'd sell it, and the girls always said no, time after time. The years start tumbling by, and in 1917, this photo was taken. In 1917, a family out of Denver came to Grand Lake, a husband and wife and their 4-year-old daughter. They came to their summer home, and they must have been well-to-do because they had a nanny taking care of the 4-year-old daughter. Her name was Myrnie Klein. Well, of course, Rob was delivering milk to that house, and he didn't deliver milk to the parents, he delivered milk to the nanny. Of course, I'm going to tell you they fell in love. Rob Harbison stood 6'4", tall, strapping man. He'd walk down the street with an 8-gallon milk can in one hand and like it was nothing. Okay, he moved a little slow because he was partially blind. Myrnie Klein, if you stretched her, came up to 5 foot nothing. In December of 1917, this was their wedding picture. They couldn't get married until December because Myrnie's grandmother said she could not get married until she turned 17. So 3 days after her 17th birthday, she married 49-year-old Rob Harbison. You can see Rob's blindness in this picture pretty good. But Myrnie Klein in this picture is standing up, and Rob is sitting down. This wonderful wedding photo. The lady on the right, Myrnie Klein, is my great aunt. She was my grandma's sister. I knew my great aunt and my great uncle Rob and Myrnie very, very well when I was a little boy. I played at their home in Grand Lake and then in a small community of Berthoud north of Denver when I was a little boy. I knew them very, very well. And that's why 17 years ago, I put this program together to deliver as a volunteer inside Rocky Mountain National Park. The years start tumbling by. Myrnie and Rob left the ranch. They moved downtown Grand Lake and had some rental cabins of their own that they were renting out. But the girls still had the dairy ranch, and Mame was still living at the ranch. In 1923, Mother passed away. Again, just a wonderful life that she had had. Moved from her home in eastern Nebraska to Denver to start life over again. Started life over again in Grand Lake and passed away in 1923. The ranch continued on, and a few years later, Mame, who was still at the ranch, married one of the ranch hands that they had hired. His name was Clyde Gudgel. Had beautiful red hair. They called him Red. And that was 1930. Well, they had just before 1930, they had a son in 1930. His name was Howard. That's him standing there in front of Mame. That's my Uncle Rob off to the left with that pipe in his mouth like he always had. I don't even need to tell you that on the right, it's Annie and Kitty because they're still holding hands. And another dog named Scout. I've seen pictures of 7 different dogs on the Harbison Ranch, and they were all named Scout. I don't know why. Maybe when they get to heaven, they all know each other. But the ranch continued on for many years. This is a photo of Howard Gudgel when he was 10 or 11 years old, about 10 miles up the valley at the Holsworth Ranch. Now it's a historic site. This is John III Holsworth and his sister. His sister only lived to be 14 years old. But John grew up on the Holsworth Ranch, and this picture is so fitting of the two boys. Howard Gudgel, in the shirt and tie, grew up and became an engineer in the oil field business. John Holsworth grew up to be a cowboy and ran the Dude Ranch. This is the outbuildings at the Harbison Ranch. The large two-story building on the right there is where the ranch hands would live. And the small building in front of it, that was the four-hole outhouse. Down here was a chicken coop in front of it. Off to the back on the left was a big barn. You can see how they kind of added to it over the years, a different section, a different section. Now, I can't hear anybody right now during the presentation, but I know some of you groaned when I said four-hole outhouse. How could they possibly, and why could they possibly have a four-hole outhouse? It wasn't assigned seating. And face it, nobody is good enough friends to go in a four-hole outhouse. When you dig an outhouse pit, you dig it deep, so you don't have to move the outhouse as often. But in Grand Lake, where the Harbison Ranch is, you dig down 3 feet, you hit a boulder the size of a VW Bug. So they built their outhouse sideways so they didn't have to move it as often. That's all. This is probably my favorite picture of the Harbison girls. We believe this picture was taken in 1938. That's Kitty on the left and Annie on the right. This is one of those pictures that all of us hate. Come on outside real quick. I want to take your picture. No. You know, I need to brush my hair. I've got to change my shirt. Let me clean up. No, it didn't happen this one. Their hair is a little mussed. Kitty's apron has a torn pocket and flour on it. Annie's kind of petting the dog Scout. And the beautiful geraniums in the window behind him. I'd like to read something to you. This was written by a dear friend of the Harbison girls. Her name was Carolyn Roan. The Roans are another family that homesteaded about 10 miles from the Harbison Ranch. She wrote, "The Harbison girls are gone, and their going was as brave and simple and poignant as their living. The long winter shadows of the never summer range down the North Fork Valley will no longer fall upon their evening activities about the homestead. Spruce and pine boughs are heaped high over a double grave in the hilltop cemetery so near their ranch. Stricken with pneumonia 10 days ago, the lives of both Kitty, age 66, and Annie, age 70, were despaired of from the beginning. Kitty passed away at noon on election day. Annie lingered until dawn Sunday, November 13th, 1938. Kitty took to her bed first. Annie, already ill, continued her work about the cabin, refusing to go to bed until she had cooked a good dinner. Then, with her temperature already near 105, she made a brave fight for her life, not knowing when Kitty was taken away to the little cabin. No one told her that Kitty had gone on ahead. The Harbison girls were part and parcel of the early pioneer life of Middle Park. Known and loved by the whole Grand Lake country, their home, so typical of the early days, with sturdy log cabins, providing a feeling of security and an atmosphere of real Western hospitality, has been visited by tourists the country over. Kitty and Annie's friends were not bounded by the mountains of Middle Park. And Grand Lake mourns as one family for the passing of the Harbison girls. All the countryside flocking to the funeral echoed the tribute paid by Charles Hulack, the pastor of the Grand Lake Community Church. He said, "Annie and Kitty Harbison were typical of the pioneer stock which has furnished the sinews and courage necessary in opening the new frontier which this mountain country has been. They and kindred souls like them have furnished the backbone for the development of this great nation of ours. Living quietly and unobtrusively, they have lived a good life and have filled their niche in this world with little left undone behind them." When Annie and Kitty passed away, of course, when they fell ill, it was front page news in the local newspaper, but it was picked up by the wire service and put out, and both the Denver Post and Rocky Mountain News newspapers carried the article about the Harbison girls being ill. A few days later, after they had both passed, It was front page news again locally. It was front page news in the Rocky Mountain News, and it was on page 3 of the Denver Post. But because it was on the wire service, it was carried in 69 newspapers throughout the country of the death of the Harbison girls in Grand Lake, Colorado, including on page 7 of the New York Times. Annie and Kittie's friends were not bounded by the mountains of Middle Park. So what happened to the Harbison Ranch? The girls left the entire 320-acre ranch to Mame. The girl that was the daughter of the man that Kittie Harbison jilted now owned the entire Harbison Ranch. They continued operating the ranch, and in 1950, their son Howard left to join the Air Force, never to return to Grand Lake to live. He visited quite often. I knew Howard Gudgel. But in 1954, Mame and Clyde Gudgel sold the entire Harbison Ranch to the National Park Service, and now it is all in the boundaries of Rocky Mountain National Park. Now it's your turn. What are you doing that 100 years from now, somebody in your family wants to write about your extraordinary life? Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you very much for paying attention to my program this evening.